The sound that woke me wasn't thunder or coyotes. It was that bright metal twang a fence wire makes when it snaps under tension, the kind of sound that slices right through the night and sits in your gut. And as soon as I heard it, I also caught the smell of trampled grass, the restless shuffle of 50 heads shifting in the dark, and I knew in my bones this wasn't an accident. Somebody had cut my line, and there was only one person in Willow Bend stubborn or petty enough to do it. I was out of bed, boots half-laced, flashlight in my teeth, that cool pre-dawn breeze sliding past the screen like a warning, and my mind already a step ahead of my feet. Because when your pasture kisses up against suburbia, you learn to think in contingencies. You learn your neighbors' moods by their porch lights, and you learn which fights are worth having. And I'll be honest with you, this one was already personal. Sycamore Point sits right across my fence like a glossy brochure. HOA covenants printed thicker than a Bible, lawns fed like show dogs, hedges trimmed with spirit levels. And right at the tip of that spear is their board president, Brittany Halford, a woman who believes property values are a religion, and she is both preacher and sheriff. My land isn't in their HOA. Never has been. The deed goes back 3 families and a dairy that once shipped cream by rail. But Brittany has a way of speaking like maps or suggestions, and my fence line is a personal insult. And 2 weeks before that twang, she'd stood on my gravel drive, arms folded in a monogrammed windbreaker, telling me my rustic aesthetic was disruptive and that my livestock containment might not meet Sycamore Point standards. I told her my cows were contained just fine by a fence that predated her McMansion, and she smiled like a person smiles when they're already planning a workaround. When I hit the break in the wire, I didn't need a detective kit to see the story. Clean cut, tied off tails, no sag from age. And there in the dewy grass, a fresh pair of orange-handled bolt cutters glinting under my flashlight like a dropped confession. And over my shoulder came a sound I will forever replay when I need a laugh. 50 hungry bovines discovering Brittany's emerald carpet and imported roses, and making a break for what can only be described as an all-you-can-eat HOA buffet. It was slapstick and beautiful, calves prancing through her flower beds like they owned the deed, a big old steer planting himself in the middle of her limestone path with the dignity of a senator, one troublemaker splashing into the decorative fountain she'd put in last spring, heads down in her landscaping like it had been grown for them, and Brittany herself frozen on the porch in a silk robe and foam hair rollers, the bolt cutters still in her hand because of course she hadn't thought. Through step 2, she made a soft ah sound, like someone watching a magician realize the trick is happening on them. And then those big HOA eyes snapped to me. "You cut the wrong wire, Brittany," I said. And I didn't raise my voice because you don't raise your voice to a stampede, bovine or human. You just let gravity and truth do their work. "Get them out," she shrieked, the scream breaking in the middle. "Cole, you get them out of here this instant." And she was waving her arms like you can shoo a storm, which the cows took as a suggestion to chew slower. They were in, I told her, leaning on the fence post like a man admiring problems he didn't create, until someone invited them out with those cutters, and I nodded toward the evidence at her feet, which she kicked into the grass like a kid hiding a crayon, and then tried to play the card she always plays, authority. "Your animals are trespassing," she said, chin high. "You'll pay for every blade of grass." And I laughed. I won't pretend I didn't. Because there is a flavor of irony, so perfect it goes down like cold water in August. And what you have to understand about Brittany is she truly believes rules bend for righteous people, and she believes she is righteous by definition. Neighbors were waking up by then, porch lights popping, curtains twitching, the sound of camera phones trying not to be obvious. And my favorite character in this whole tale, old Mr. Dugan with the veteran cap 2 houses down, he stepped onto his stoop and called out in a voice dry as gravel, "Guess the grass really is greener, Cole." And the laughter that rolled across Sycamore Point curled the edges of Brittany's composure. A sheriff's cruiser slid up in those blue and red pulses that make everything look like theater, Deputy Ray Calder stepping out slow, eyes taking in the sagging wire, the bolt cutters, the cows eating a Lexus brochure for breakfast, and when Brittany pointed at me like she was blowing a whistle, yelling about negligence and sabotage, Ray didn't even pretend not to notice the cutters still wet with dew. He crouched, bagged them, gave me a look that said hang tight, let her talk, this once. Going to right itself. By mid-morning the cows were penned again, a temporary splice holding the line until I could dig new posts. and I was on my porch with coffee when I found the crisp, white envelope taped to my mailbox. Sycamore Point letterhead, my name misspelled, the fine print written like scripture. A disciplinary hearing I was required to attend for negligent containment, along with a $5,000 assessment for community landscape restoration, which is a very HOA way of saying pay us for the buffet. You didn't serve. I laughed out loud, because my acreage is 100 yards outside their covenant map and they know it. But Brittany loves a stage and she loves a gavel, so I drove into town, bought heavier gauge wire and deeper posts, and when I rebuilt that afternoon, I hung bright yellow signs along the property line facing her yard. Private property. Do not cut fence. Livestock enclosed. More for her conscience than for the law. And I will admit I hammered those signs with a little extra music in my shoulders. I wasn't going to go to their hearing. Then I remembered that control freaks melt fastest under calm defiance. So I showed up in a clean flannel and boots, sat in a plastic chair, while Brittany banged a gavel like she was calling court to order, and listened to her read from a sheet where my name appeared 6 times and the word community appeared 12. And when she finally paused for applause, I raised my hand. One thing, I said, tiny technicality. I'm not in your HOA. And you could feel the room shift. The guy at the end of the table who jogs past my pasture every morning cleared his throat and muttered. Technically his parcel is outside our charter. And Brittany's smile got that thin white border around it you see on weather maps right before the cold front hits. But she kept climbing the hill she'd picked, accused me of endangerment. I reminded her she'd cut the fence in front of a deputy. And when I asked if Ray should come testify, you could have heard the air conditioning click. She banged the gavel and announced we'd reconvene, with legal counsel present. And I told her I'd bring mine too, plus a few neighbors who enjoyed last night's lawn show. Laughter bubbled, and that's when I knew the audience was slipping from her hands. That evening I wrote a 2-paragraph post in the neighborhood Facebook group, polite as a church bulletin, something like, for anyone concerned about last night's cattle incident, the herd is secure. The fence was compromised by an unknown party. Law enforcement has the report. Thanks to the neighbors who helped. And then I put my phone down and let the community do what communities do when truth shows up with receipts. Within an hour, the comments were a flood. Videos appeared. Cows in rose bushes. Brittany yelling into the night. The bolt cutters on the grass. And I didn't call her out by name. I didn't need to. People tagged who they wanted. Someone made a meme of my bull sitting on her walkway with the caption free lawn service, and by sunset Brittany's profile was gone. 2 mornings later, a contractor truck delivered panels of glossy white vinyl to Brittany's curb, and by lunch she had a fence tall enough to hide behind and smooth enough to photograph. And she stood with her arms crossed while the crew admired their plumb lines, shooting me a look that said checkmate, which I returned with a little wave because I know cows and I know vinyl. And that was never going to end the way she thought. The first pop sounded like a knuckle cracking. A heifer leaned into that shiny panel to scratch her flank, and the whole thing bowed like a cheap drum. A second later, there was a brittle snap, and the panel didn't explode so much as sigh. And by the time Brittany got to the break in her bathrobe yelling about monsters, another cow had discovered how satisfying it was to walk the whole line and use it like the world's largest back scratcher. Animal control showed up that afternoon because Brittany had filed a cruelty complaint. I met Officers Sonia Whitaker and her partner at the line, pointed to my side where the wire was tight and legal, then to hers where the vinyl drooped like taffy. Sonia touched the panel with 2 fingers and said, "Ma'am, this is ornamental, not a livestock barrier." And Brittany's face did that thing again where pride meets physics and loses. Word spread. As it does, somebody posted a parody account for the fence that kept daily logs. Day 6. Another panel falls. Morale low. Cows victorious. And even I had to admit it was art. Then came the HOA's big tent meeting. Folding chairs packed wall to wall. Brittany at the front with blown-up photos of her mangled vinyl like crime scene exhibits. She called me a hazard to the community. I stood and repeated the only line that matters. They were contained until you cut the line. And Mrs. Voss, who's lived there since before the builders poured the first slab, raised a hand and said, "Honey, the only danger I saw was you yelling at cows in a nightgown." And the laughter that erupted knocked a few of Brittany's supporters right off the wagon. Embarrassment doesn't slow people like her. It accelerates them. So the next week a crane brought in a steel gate big enough to hold a prison break. Keypad, motor, reinforcement ribs, the works. She clicked it open and shut like a kid with a new toy. Neighbors started calling it Fortress Brittany, and the name stuck in about 5 minutes. Then the storm rolled in, a hard summer squall that turned the clay to pudding and knocked the power mid-cycle. And at 2 in the morning, that gate seized half-closed and settled its full weight on the hood of Brittany's Lexus with a sound you could feel in your molars. We stood in the rain as the tow crew winched the gate up with another truck while kids in pajama pants filmed from porches, and Deputy Calder almost swallowed his laugh. And when the car came free, it wore a steel kiss across the hood like a signature. The lawsuit hit next: emotional distress, property destruction, public ridicule. She asked for 50 grand, and my lawyer, Nate Burnham, showed up to court in a wrinkled gray suit like a man who likes fishing better than fighting, but will happily do both if the day calls for it. Brittany had a gel-haired litigator and a stack of binders. They paraded photos of the mangled fence and the gate-kissed Lexus. And then Nate stood, cleared his throat, and read one document in a steady voice. Deputy Calder's report, which spelled out where the bolt cutters were found and who was holding them. And then he set those orange-handled cutters on the evidence table with a clatter that made the bailiff grin. Mr. Dugan testified about the nightgown opera. Mrs. Voss told the HOA story. The tow truck guy described winning the tug-of-war with the gate. And by the time the judge leaned forward and said he saw no grounds for her claims and did see strong grounds for my counterclaim, Brittany's posture had shrunk 3 sizes. Fees and damages awarded, gavel down, case dismissed, and out on the courthouse steps neighbors shook my hand like I'd won a county fair pie contest. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it. But wounded pride is a dangerous animal. It doesn't heal, it hunts. And when I found a scatter of blue pellets tossed just inside my fence a week later, my stomach went cold, because that wasn't mischief, that was bait. We bagged it. Animal control took samples. Everyone knew the only person with motive and nerve, but proof moves slow when it wears a uniform, so I did what I do best. I went long game. I hid cameras in fence posts and rafters, put a livestock-safe low-voltage shock on the known tampering spots, set a few decoy salt licks laced with harmless dye that stains like a toddler's marker, and 3 nights later my phone buzzed at 2:07 a.m. with a motion alert. There she was, hood up, flashlight in her mouth like a cartoon burglar, snipping a spot I'd reinforced, reaching for the salt, and when her hands wrapped around it, her palms bloomed neon pink, even under infrared. I sat there at my kitchen table laughing into my sleeve like a guilty teenager, and at dawn I posted the clip to the neighborhood group with exactly 4 words: fence bandit, pink-handed, and I didn't include a name because I didn't need to, and by noon Brittany's hands were the talk of Willow Bend. Deputies cited her for trespass and vandalism, small charges on paper, nuclear socially, and even the board stopped returning her calls. Cornered animals charge, and Brittany dug in, hired a private security outfit that set up drones and spotlights like we were guarding a mint, which took about 48 hours to blow up in her face when one of the drones buzzed a kid's birthday party and a dad put it out of the sky with a throw that would have made a shortstop proud. The deputies told them to ground the wasp nest. The HOA called a meeting without her for the first time, and a quiet settled over Sycamore Point that felt like folks finally remembering how to breathe. Then came the dig. A bulldozer rumbling up to carve a trench along the line. Brittany on her driveway waving a sheaf of permits like a baton, and before that operator could lower the blade, the rain-soft ground slid sideways, and the whole machine sank nose first through her own vinyl like a giraffe tripping into a wedding cake. And the videos got picked up by local news. Captions like HOA trench goes full Titanic. And that should have been the final act. Curtain call, lessons learned. Except humiliation on the internet is gasoline on pride. And 2 days later, I heard helicopter rotors beating the air above the pasture. Not news choppers, but a livestock transport outfit Brittany had apparently hired for a private roundup. Trailers lined her curb. Men with prods and ropes tried to herd cows like you herd cats. And the helicopter hovered low enough to flatten the roses they were supposed to save. A sling dangling like a bad idea looking for a victim. Careful, Brittany. I called across the line, hands in my pockets, heart steady because panic spooks a herd, and I was not going to give her that. Those aren't your cows. And she shouted back that they were a menace and that today they were gone. Here's the thing about cows. They don't respect clipboards. They respect patience. And inside 5 minutes, one young bull sent a worker scrambling over her own fence, and the herd folded back on itself like a school of fish. The pilot dropped the sling, misjudged the swing by about a driveway, and instead of lifting a cow, he snagged the top bar of that steel gate. You could see it hook like a fish, and then the machine tugged, and the gate came out of the ground with a groan like a haunted house, and for one perfect 5-second window, Fortress Brittany lifted off, rising into the morning like a ridiculous trophy, before the pilot panicked and dropped it right onto Brittany's Lexus, again, the crunch carrying all the way to my porch, and neighbors fell over laughing. Kids yelped like they'd seen a magic trick, and one of my cows let out a low, satisfied moo that might as well have been applause. Deputies rolled in. The transport company retreated, the helicopter peeled off, and the herd went back to grazing like a prayer answered. That afternoon, the HOA released a statement removing Brittany as president and apologizing to the entire subdivision for ongoing disruptions by a single member. And the next morning, Brittany held a press conference on her lawn in front of the crumpled gate, where she declared herself the victim of a smear campaign by reckless agrarians. Her word, not mine. And halfway through that speech, a heifer wandered to the fence behind her and leaned into the microphone with a long, soulful moo that made the camera crews buckle at the knees. And by supper, she wasn't just local news. She was a national punchline. Life for me slipped back to quiet the way it always does when you let chaos run its course. I sunk new corner posts. I ran hot wire on the inside just for peace of mind. Neighbors dropped by with six-packs and stories. Deputy Calder slowed at the mailbox and called out, "You keeping it calm, Cole?" And I told him calm is my only trick. Folks think I won because the internet laughed or the judge banged a gavel. But what I learned was simpler and meaner and kinder than that. You don't beat people like Brittany by being louder or meaner. You beat them by staying steady, by knowing your rights, by documenting every inch, and by letting them build their own prisons out of their own pride, even if those prisons look like steel gates and drones. Sometimes I stand at the fence in the cool part of the morning with coffee and listen to the herd breathe, the way they exhale in unison when the sun hits the pasture just right. And I catch myself smiling when one of them scratches her flank against the post where Brittany once stood yelling about standards. And I think about boundaries, how some people confuse control with safety, how an HOA can keep a neighborhood tidy, but it can't keep a soul honest, and how a community will always, eventually, side with the truth it can see and touch. You tell me, though, where's the line for you between order and overreach, between protecting a neighborhood and policing a way of life, between a person's right to their land and a board's love of rules? Would you have handled Brittany differently? Would you have pressed charges harder or poured her a glass of lemonade and tried to talk it out when the cutters were still warm? Drop your take in the comments. Tell me what justice looks like when a lawn, a fence, and 50 cows are in the balance. And if you've ever had your own run-in with a little empire on a cul-de-sac, share that story too. Because out here, the thing that travels faster than a rumor is a good reminder we're neighbors first and everything else after.